They called it reckless. They called him a madman. They called the idea illegal. But when merchant convoys vanished under moonless skies and entire squadrons of escorts scratched their heads over hulls ripped apart, someone had to try the thing no admiral would sign off on. In a cramped, oil-stained workshop far from the Admiralty, an engineer stared at a battered schematic and smiled. Rules were written for polite wars, not for nights when the sea itself seemed to conspire with the enemy. He bent a law, rewired a detonator, and took a weapon designed for one purpose and turned it into a different kind of monster, a device that didn't need to catch a ship to kill it. It only needed to make the oceans sing. What followed reads like a banned chapter of naval history. Stealthy strikes that left captains baffled, harbors turned into graves, and a navy forced to chase ghosts of explosions with no clear culprit. This is the story of one outlaw idea, one engineer's gamble, and the invention that became the ultimate ship killer. 1942. The Atlantic wasn't a sea anymore, it was a graveyard. German U-boats hunted Allied convoys day and night. Ships burned in silence, lifeboats drifted, and even the seagulls stopped circling the wrecks. The Royal Navy called it the Black Gap, the area in the mid-Atlantic where no escort, no radar, and no rescue could reach in time. Every week, more tonnage vanished beneath the waves. The math was simple and terrifying. If this continued, Britain would starve before Christmas. In London, inside the Ministry of Aircraft Production, a young engineer named Louis Mountbatten's protégé, Dr. Edward Terrell, watched reports of destroyed ships pile up on his desk. Terrell wasn't a sailor. He was a chemist, physicist, and problem solver. One of those minds who saw patterns where others saw chaos. He noticed something strange. Most Allied weapons at sea, depth charges, torpedoes, mines, all obeyed one rule. They had to make contact or be close to explode. That rule made sense to bureaucrats, but not to Terrell. He believed that rule was killing them. What if a weapon didn't have to touch a ship, but could sense it, hunt it, and destroy it before even being seen? He drafted a design. It wasn't new metal or new explosives. It was a new mind. He called it the magnetic mine. Terrell's device would detect the magnetic field of a ship's steel hull. The moment it passed above it, the mine would trigger automatically. It didn't need a direct hit. The ocean itself would deliver the blast. It was elegant, deadly, and, according to Royal Navy regulations, completely illegal. You see, after the First World War, magnetic and acoustic mines had been banned under international maritime law. They were considered unethical, too unpredictable, and too likely to kill civilians or neutral vessels. But to Terrell, ethics meant nothing if your men were dying by the thousands. He took the plans to his superiors. They refused. Too dangerous, too unstable, out of the question. So he did what desperate men always do in desperate wars. He built it anyway. In a hidden lab near Portsmouth, Terrell and a handful of volunteers began testing prototypes. They lowered crude versions of the magnetic trigger into barrels, then into shallow waters, watching the needles twitch whenever a steel vessel passed above. Each time, the readings were perfect. The theory was sound. The ocean could be turned into a trap. But there was a problem. The enemy had already done it. In late 1939, German mines started washing ashore on British beaches. They were magnetic, just like Terrell's designs. Every time one detonated, it sent a ripple of panic through the Admiralty. Ships were exploding without warning, sometimes even inside protected harbors. The Royal Navy was desperate to understand how. Terrell, the man they'd dismissed, was suddenly summoned to explain the unexplainable. He took one look at the recovered fragments and said quietly, "They've done it. They've broken the same law we refuse to." Now Britain had a choice: obey the rules or fight back on the enemy's terms. Terrell made his pitch again, this time to Winston Churchill himself. He promised a countermeasure that could not only detect German mines, but create British ones even more sophisticated. Churchill, never one for hesitation, simply said, "Then do it, and do it quickly." The war at sea was about to change forever. The line between legal and lethal had just been erased. The order came down from Churchill with the kind of brevity only a wartime prime minister could deliver. Make it work. If it breaks a rule, change the rule. Dr. Edward Terrell and his small band of scientists moved into a sealed workshop near Portsmouth dockyard, a place known only as HMS Vernon, the Royal Navy's mine warfare school. Behind the steel doors, welders sparked through the night, and the smell of cordite hung in the air. The goal? Design a mine that could think, one that could sense a ship by its presence alone. The first experiments. They began with small charges in barrels. When a passing tugboat altered the needle on Terrell's oscilloscope, the room erupted. The magnetic coils reacted perfectly to the ship's field. A month later, they tested in shallow water. The explosion lifted a column of seawater 50 feet high. The admiral overseeing the test muttered, "Illegal or not, it works." But the victory came with a problem. The magnetic field of Earth itself could trigger the device. Several test mines detonated prematurely, blasting open the seabed. Terrell recalculated, adding a balance coil to cancel the planet's pull. His notebooks filled with equations and burn marks. By autumn 1940, he had built a new prototype, Mine Type D. Stable, compact, and deadly accurate, turning the tables. Meanwhile, German magnetic mines were still sinking Allied shipping. Every port from Hull to Bristol lived in fear of invisible killers. British divers recovered fragments, and Terrell's team reversed-engineered the circuits. Within weeks, they created counter-detectors that could sweep harbors, followed by their own magnetic mines to return the favor. The first British deployment came quietly. Under moonlight, a pair of motor torpedo boats slipped out of Dover, towing a line of strange spheres. Each mine was armed, set to detonate when the magnetic signature of a ship passed overhead. They released them off the Dutch coast, a shipping route the Kriegsmarine used daily. 2 nights later, German radio traffic lit up with confusion. A destroyer reported a sudden explosion beneath calm water, then another, then a merchantman. The British had not fired a shot, yet the sea was claiming ships on its own. Terrell's illegal idea was now a weapon, and a terrifying one. Accidents and sabotage success brought danger. In December 1940, while demonstrating a modified fuse to naval officers, a miswired unit detonated prematurely. The blast killed 2 men and shattered every window in the lab. Terrell was thrown against a wall, half-deaf for weeks. Admiralty lawyers argued to shut the project down again. Churchill intervened. Greater than, "The Germans won't stop because of paperwork. Neither will we." The team moved their work to a coastal bunker, away from civilians. They refined the design, adding acoustic triggers that could listen for propeller frequencies. By combining magnetic and acoustic sensors, they created the Mark 17 mine, a device capable of recognizing specific types of ships. Soon, British bombers began sowing them in German waterways, the Kiel Canal, the Elbe, the approaches to Hamburg. Within months, the effect was catastrophic. Barge traffic halted, dockyards were paralyzed. Even the mighty battleship Tirpitz was forced to remain in port for fear of unseen mines. The turning tide. In 1943, Allied intelligence intercepted reports from the German Naval High Command. "The enemy's sea mines are undetectable. Our sweepers cannot locate the magnetic signature." Terrell's illegal weapon had done what fleets and convoys could not. It had locked the enemy inside his own harbors. The balance of the Atlantic shifted, but the weapon wasn't perfect. Storms sometimes displaced the mines. A few broke free, drifting into neutral waters. One exploded near a Swedish freighter, prompting diplomatic protests. Terrell, summoned to Whitehall, stood before officials and accepted responsibility. "Greater than war is never clean," he said quietly, "but better one stray explosion than 1,000 lost convoys." Churchill agreed, but ordered tighter controls. From then on, every magnetic mine carried a unique code. If it failed to arm properly, it could be identified as British. It was the first step toward modern smart mine technology. The birth of the ship killer. By 1944, Terrell's design evolved again. Engineers added pressure sensors that could detect the displacement wave of a passing ship. Invisible, silent, impossible to evade. Combined with magnetic triggers, it became the ultimate ship killer. During Operation Starvation, the Allies used similar pressure magnetic mines to block Japanese supply routes in the Pacific. Within months, Japan's merchant fleet was crippled. The same concept born in Terrell's illegal workshop had crossed oceans, a war won beneath the surface. By the time the Normandy landings began, the tide of the sea war had completely reversed. Allied mines guarded the flanks, German U-boats struggled to leave port, and convoys crossed the Atlantic under skies that finally felt safe. Terrell, still limping from his earlier injuries, watched ships streaming toward France and whispered to a colleague, "They'll never know the war we fought underwater." The invention that began as a crime had become one of the most decisive weapons of the entire conflict. Spring, 1944. The grey North Sea looked peaceful from above, but beneath its surface lay thousands of silent predators, the mines born from one outlaw idea. The British called it Operation Maple, a prelude to D-Day. Every channel the Germans could use for reinforcements had to be sealed, and Terrell's team was tasked with designing the weapons to do it. The final version of his creation, the Mk-17 Combined Magnetic Pressure Mine, was ready. Each one held nearly 1,000 pounds of Torpex explosive, packed into a steel shell designed to rest on the seabed for months. When a ship passed overhead, the subtle distortion of Earth's magnetic field and the pressure wave from the hull combined to arm the trigger. 2 seconds later, the ocean erupted. Terrell knew the physics by heart. When the blast wave traveled upward, it created a gas bubble that lifted a vessel out of the water, bending its keel until it snapped. Even if the ship didn't break, the shock would crush bulkheads, kill engines, and send men flying. No armor could resist that kind of force. The mine didn't just sink ships, it tore them apart. The test of fire. In early May, a squadron of RAF Coastal Command bombers took off from England, their bomb bays loaded with Terrell's mines. Their target, the Kiel Canal, Germany's naval artery. They flew low under radar, dropped their loads, and vanished into the night. Within days, chaos erupted along the German coast. Barges and destroyers struck invisible walls. Entire convoys stopped moving. The canal had to be closed for weeks, paralyzing the movement of fuel and ammunition to the front. When Allied intelligence reported that the Germans had deployed their entire fleet of minesweepers and still failed to clear the route, Terrell finally allowed himself a rare smile. His illegal idea had done more to bottle up the Kriegsmarine than any surface battle could. But the victory came at a cost. The minefield didn't care who entered it. One British trawler, diverted by weather, vanished near the same area. Terrell was devastated. He'd built a weapon too perfect, one that obeyed only physics, not flags. He requested the use of sterilizers, tiny chemical timers that would neutralize the mines after a set number of days. The Admiralty agreed. From that moment, every British mine carried a built-in expiry, a small act of conscience in a war that rarely allowed any. D-Day's invisible shield, June 6, 1944. As Allied fleets gathered for the invasion of Normandy, Terrell stood on a clifftop near Portsmouth, watching thousands of ships slide toward the horizon. Behind the armada lay the work of his team, an ocean laced with magnetic guardians. For months, they had laid defensive belts along the channel approaches, mines that would detonate only under the unique magnetic signatures of German U-boats. When the invasion began, those U-boats tried to break through and never made it. Out of nearly 60 submarines that attempted to reach the beaches, over half were lost. Many never even fired a torpedo. The Admiralty never broadcast the reason, but Terrell knew. The sea itself had become their ally. As reports flooded in, one message stood out: greater than enemy submarines exploding before contact. No survivors, no warning. The ultimate ship killer had completed its purpose: to end a threat before it began. The engineer and the ethics. When victory in Europe was declared, Terrell was invited to Whitehall for a debrief. In the great oak-paneled room, surrounded by senior admirals, he was asked to explain what his invention had done to the enemy's fleet. He laid a folder of statistics on the table: tonnage sunk, harbors closed, supply routes destroyed. Then he added a second sheet: civilian losses caused by mines that had drifted or failed to deactivate. The silence was heavy. An admiral finally said, "You realize, Doctor, that none of this would have been legal before the war." Terrell looked up, eyes tired. "Neither was sinking hospitals, sir. The enemy taught us new rules." He was not defending himself, only the necessity that war had forced on science. For the rest of his life, he would argue that technology had no morality, only those who used it did. A reckoning beneath the waves. Even after the war ended, Terrell's mines continued to claim ships. For years, salvage teams along the European coast heard muffled explosions at night, delayed fuses, forgotten stockpiles, the echoes of an ocean still armed. In one haunting report, a fisherman off Denmark swore he saw a calm patch of water rise like a breath before collapsing in a flash. Terrell personally led clearance efforts, designing deactivation devices to make his own creations harmless. It was slow, dangerous work. Several divers died removing live mines. Each loss weighed heavier than any medal he received. When asked why he insisted on helping, he said quietly, "I made the sea angry. I should be the one to calm it." Recognition. In 1946, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire for exceptional service to mine warfare. Officially, his work remained classified for decades. Unofficially, every naval engineer in the post-war world built upon his designs. Magnetic influence fuses became standard. Pressure sensors evolved into proximity torpedoes. The entire field of underwater warfare traced its lineage to the illegal idea from a cold lab in Portsmouth. Terrell never saw himself as a hero. He often visited the memorial at Tower Hill, where the names of merchant sailors lost to the Atlantic were carved in stone. There, the real story he'd tell students: "We just built tools so fewer names would need carving." By the time he retired, the Royal Navy had declassified much of his work. Engineers studying his notebooks still found his scribbled warning on the cover page: "Greater than, the ocean has no side." The legacy of a rule breaker. The magnetic mine changed the logic of naval war forever. No longer was victory decided by the number of ships or guns, but by unseen forces humming beneath the waves. It forced nations to rethink ethics, engineering, and the limits of human imagination. Terrell's illegal idea had started as a violation and ended as a revolution. It saved convoys, trapped fleets, and turned the tide of the Atlantic. But he always insisted on one truth: weapons don't win wars. They just buy the time for men to finish them. The ocean that once devoured Allied shipping became their silent protector. And deep below, in the cold darkness, where no admiral's law could reach, the engineer's forbidden creation kept watch. Proof that sometimes, to save the world, you have to break its rules. When the war ended, the seas of Europe were a patchwork of ghosts. Thousands of Terrell's magnetic and pressure mines still slept beneath the waves, humming softly, waiting for hulls that would never come. Merchant captains plotted new routes. Fishermen prayed their nets would never drag across the wrong patch of seabed. The ocean had become a museum of human invention and fear. The long unwinding for the Royal Navy, peace meant a different kind of war. The clearance campaign. Divers and engineers risked their lives dismantling the very weapons that had saved them. Terrell returned to Portsmouth to help. His hair had turned grey, his hearing half gone, but he insisted on standing at the pier each time a recovered mine was hoisted onto a barge. Sometimes he'd run his hand across the corroded casing and whisper, "Sleep now." By 1955, over 54,000 mines had been neutralized in British waters alone. The lessons learned in removing them became the blueprint for modern demining. Careful mapping, acoustic shielding, robotic probes. Terrell's inventions had birthed not only a weapon, but an entire science of undoing it. From secret to study. In the 1960s, as the Cold War heated the oceans again, NATO scientists quietly reopened Terrell's files. His magnetic pressure logic inspired the first anti-submarine proximity torpedoes and influenced trigger mines used by both East and West. When asked for consultation, Terrell refused payment. "I've done enough damage," he said, but he still sent annotated copies of his wartime notebooks to young naval engineers. On the first page, he wrote, "Greater than a good invention asks you who will pay its bill." Universities began teaching the Terrell principle, the idea that technological morality depends on who defines the battlefield. His once illegal theory had become academic law, the weight of innovation. Despite medals and invitations, Terrell lived modestly. Reporters wanted a hero. He gave them a warning. Every weapon starts as an experiment. The question is never if it works, but whether we'll stop when it does. In interviews, he credited the sailors who died in the early years of the Atlantic campaign. "Their loss forced us to think differently. My equations were written in their names." He never called his device a mine. He called it an underwater ambush. He knew it changed more than tactics. It changed psychology. From then on, every ship's captain sailed, knowing that the calm surface could hide instant death. Fear itself became part of warfare. The ocean's memory. By the 1970s, demining ships were still finding relics of his designs buried under layers of silt. Each recovery reminded nations how close genius and danger sit together. In 1974, a trawler off Denmark triggered one of the old pressure mines. It destroyed the boat, but left the crew alive. Terrell, retired in Sussex, read the news and wrote a final letter to the Admiralty. "The sea remembers longer than we do. Do not trust it to forget." That sentence was later carved on a memorial plaque at HMS Vernon, now a museum of naval innovation. A new generation, younger engineers who visited him, found not a hardened weapons maker, but a patient teacher surrounded by sketches and sea charts. He spoke of the joy of discovery, the burden of consequence, and the beauty of mathematics that could move mountains or oceans. When a student asked if he regretted breaking international law, he smiled faintly. "If the law can't keep men alive, change the law, but write it again when the war is done." The final years. In his last decade, Terrell walked the southern coast almost daily. Locals often saw him staring out at the horizon where the channel meets the sky, murmuring the tides like an old friend. He said he could still hear the deep thrum of magnetism when ships passed. He died quietly in 1979. His wartime papers sealed for another 10 years. When they were finally declassified, historians called him the man who made the sea think. Naval officers credited him with saving untold thousands of sailors. Environmentalists cursed the mines, still rusting in silence. Both were right. Legacy. Today, every Navy's mine and torpedo system uses principles Terrell refined in that hidden lab. The sensors are smaller, the circuits smarter, but the heart of the weapon, that invisible handshake between metal and magnetism, remains his. The ethics of autonomous weapons still circle back to him. His name appears in debates about artificial intelligence, about drones that decide when to kill. The parallel is uncanny. Another generation teaching machines to act on invisible cues, just as Terrell once taught the ocean. At the National Maritime Museum, a small display case holds one of his first prototypes, a rusted sphere with faded stenciling, half opened to show the coils inside. The caption reads simply, "This device changed the shape of naval warfare. It was once considered illegal. Visitors rarely linger, but those who do can almost imagine the hum inside, the quiet intelligence that waited for steel above." Epilogue. War had taken the engineer and given him a conscience forged in salt and steel. He never sought absolution, only understanding. To the end, he believed that knowledge itself was neutral, neither moral nor immoral, until a hand gave it purpose. The sea that had claimed so many lives became his final mirror, deep, restless, and full of secrets. And somewhere in those depths, perhaps, a few of his creations still rest, silent witnesses to the moment one man dared to break the rules of nature, and in doing so, taught the ocean how to kill. The forbidden idea had become history. The engineer had become legend.